In this video, I'm going to be talking about the Trinity, or the Triad, or whatever you want to call it, in resistance training. The Trinity is three fundamental sort of ideas, a part of resistance training, and these are volume, intensity, and frequency. And so these three make up, or they comprise essentially your training in its entirety almost. Everything you do can be broken down into volume, intensity, frequency. Everything that you do in the gym, how many total sets you do in a week for each muscle group, how many times you train, how much weight you use, all of that is encapsulated in volume, intensity, and frequency. So the first is volume, and volume is usually defined as the amount of sets you do. That's very vague, right? Like if I'm doing warm-up sets, does that count for volume? Probably not, because warm-up sets aren't really challenging yourself. Your goal is to simply warm yourself up, right? It doesn't do much. And if you want muscle growth from warm-up sets, well, look for another galaxy. Instead, volume should be more specific. Instead of being just how many sets you do in a week, instead the definition of volume should be something like how many hard sets you do in a week. Right? How many hard sets, the sets that actually matter, the sets that actually get you muscle growth, right? And with this definition, your volume may be drastically decreased in comparison to if you had measured volume as just the amount of sets you do, right? Because you get rid of warm-up sets, you get rid of junk volume, and that leaves the hard sets. Only that is the volume you count. And so, out of the three, volume is the most important for muscle growth. It is the one that determines the most muscle growth. The more you train, the more your body will subsequently respond. Up to a certain point, of course. But volume is the most important if you want to grow muscles. The next is intensity. Intensity can be defined as how this weight feels. Do I feel an RPE 7, RPE 9? What is the feeling of this weight? That's limited because it's subjective, right? A subjective feeling is not as valuable as in comparison to an objective. Put simply, intensity is best measured in the amount of weight you use in comparison to your 1 rep max, right? So this is the 75% of your 1 rep max for this amount of reps. That would be the most objective sign of intensity. And in comparison to volume, intensity trains for muscle strength primarily. So the more intensity you have in a program versus the amount of volume you have in a program will determine if you're emphasizing more strength versus muscle growth, right? If you have higher volume than intensity, you're going to be focusing more on muscle growth than muscle strength. If you have equal, then it's relatively going to be around the same. And so lastly, there is frequency. Frequency is basically just how frequently you work out, how frequently you go to the gym, how many sessions you go per day, how many sessions you go per week, how many days you go to the gym per week. And for the most part, frequency is dependent on your split. So what split you choose, how you split up your body, and what to train in a week, and your schedule. Like, do you have the time to go to the gym? If you don't, then you just don't. So these three are the three fundamental concepts for your resistance training. Right? You have your volume, frequency, and intensity. And so there are many different combinations. The first one being, all three of them being low. This could be like 1 to 5 sets of volume, so hard sets, 1 to 5 hard sets. Intensity being like 30% of your 1 rep max. And then, you train once a week. All three low. That is better than nothing. Okay, it's better than nothing. If you want more than better than nothing, then you're going to do better. You're going to need to do better, right? Better than nothing, all three low, is what you would expect from a sort of resistance training class that your local community center or gym sponsors. It's certainly better than nothing, but if you want muscle growth, if you want to get stronger, that's not the way to go. The next is having 1 high with 2 low, right? So let's take high volume. That would be 15 to 20 hard sets per muscle group. But you train every muscle in your body once a week, so this can be the bro split. But you do 15 to 20 hard sets on each day for each muscle group. So you're just completely dead after. And then the intensity is also low, so that means that you're training with like baby weights. You're training with like 30 to 50% of your 1 rep max. What's that going to get you? Well, first of all, a super high volume in terms of hard sets is an oxymoron, because you can't have, it's extremely hard to have a lot of volume in terms of hard sets, because you're going to be doing a lot of junk volume, right? As you keep on working out the same muscle group, your baseline is going to be lower and lower and lower, and therefore the amount of strength you can output is going to be lower and lower and lower, and therefore every set after will be using less and less weight. You'll be moving farther from your 1 rep max. So on your first exercise, if you do 5 sets of it, you're fresh. That's not junk volume, that's high quality volume. Alright, that's good. On your 15th set, you might be using 50% of the weight that you used during your first set. That's junk volume. Right? You have pushed the muscle so much that you have to lift 50% of the weight that you started with. That is pure junk volume. On the other hand, the intensity is so low that you need to do super high rep sets as well, so it's going to be a bitch to endure. But you'll have plenty of recovery time, because you're only training each body part once a week. Limitations with high volume and the other two low is that, well, sure, you get a lot of volume. You fry your body, and then you have plenty of time to recover. It's just that, though, you'll get some growth. It's better than all low. It's better than the minimal, but it's certainly not the best. The second is high intensity only. So this is basically like powerlifting training. If you were to only train once a week, right? You do squat, bench, deadlift. You do low rep, low sets. You train once a week. You do all 3 of them on the same day, or you can spread it out. That will get you strength gains. That will not get you muscle growth, but it will get you strength gains. Some, not the best, but certainly better than all low. Once again, just remember, all low is terrible. You do not want to be close to that. But having high intensity and low frequency, low volume is also not ideal if you want strength or if you want muscle growth. Right? It's not ideal for either of those. And finally, there's high frequency, low volume, low intensity, and this might actually be the best out of the 3. There's the popular greasing the groove among calisthenics, which is basically you just greasing the groove is essentially doing a shit ton of pull-ups over time. Just like every hour or 2, you just do 5 pull-ups. You just keep on going. It's not intense at all. It's low volume because you're not doing hard sets, but the frequency is very high. Right? So spread throughout the week. You're doing so many pull-ups. You're doing it so frequently that you actually do get stronger. And of course, the thing is, some people say that doing that many pull-ups that is actually a lot of volume, which, if the definition of volume is not purely hard sets, then yes, it is volume. If you're just counting reps and sets, but in this case, volume is the number of hard sets you do. And so greasing the groove, or just having frequency high, is probably the best. If you want to train specifically for a movement, you want to get better at a movement, pull-ups is one of the most popular, because everyone wants to get better at pull-ups. Everyone wants to get more pull-ups, wants to do more pull-ups, wants to get stronger at pull-ups, because pull-ups are just, one, they're hard, and therefore you can do a lot, is impressive. So the next combinations are 2 high with 1 low. And so these are I would say, the most balanced of all the options. So there's high volume and high intensity. What does this look like? This is basically like you train like a powerlifter and bodybuilder at the same time, so a power builder, but you train with low frequency, right? So you train, you do intense work at the beginning of your workouts, and then you go on to more volume training with other exercises, but you only train like muscle group once a week. Each muscle group once a week. Well, certainly you get lots of time to recover. Right? You have lots of recovery time because your frequency is so low. You get muscle and strength gains from this because you're training intensely and you're training with a lot of volume. But this is sort of the in-between between a bodybuilder and a powerlifter. Right? It's trying to take both and combine them into one, but it can't fully do that because if you were to have all of it together, it would be too much for you, unless you are accustomed to that amount of training. And I'll talk about that later in all three of them being high. The next is volume is high and frequency is high. So this is basically pure bodybuilder training. This is like low intensity, 50 to 70% of your 1 rep max, training 7 days a week, training each body part 3 times a week with 10 to 20 sets. Hard sets, that is. Right, this is pure bodybuilder training. This is the most tailored towards muscle growth, but also has limitations. One, because if you don't have intense training at all, you won't get the most muscle growth. A lot of bodybuilders go for the pump only, and that's a mistake because you need some intense training. Some intensity is required for the best and most optimal muscle growth. And whilst I say that high volume and high frequency is the best for a bodybuilder, because volume drives a lot of the growth, intensity also plays a role. So it's still limited if you forego all intensity. So if you want to do high volume and high frequency right, you want to do at least moderate to slightly high intensity, so that's like 70 to 85% of your 1 rep max. You want to be in that range. Do hard sets and still train with a lot of frequency. That is the best for muscle growth. If you stick to 30 to 50%, that is simply just not the best way to get muscle growth. The final one is high intensity and high frequency. And so this is sort of the best mode for powerlifting, right? You train very intensely and very frequently. You get all the neurological adaptations. You train frequently, so you just keep pushing. It's the best for strength gains. But you'll be limited because if you only train for neurological adaptations, in order to maximize your strength, you need to gain more muscle so that you can access a more maximum amount of muscle tissue. The thing with neurological adaptations is that you can access more and use more of your muscle fibers, but if you have more muscle fibers in general, you just have more access to more muscle fibers and therefore more strength. Right? So training for strength comprises of using the most amount of muscle fibers and also having more muscle fibers so that it can influence the first factor and get you more strength. Which is why most powerlifters and most people who train for strength have a hypertrophy phase where they gain more muscle, and then a neurological or adaptation phase or a strength phase where they use the added muscle for the strength goals. So finally there is all high. All three of them higher. High intensity, high volume, high frequency. Everything is high. And this isn't as comparable to all low. Right? It's not as bad as all low, certainly, but it is pretty bad because you'll be fatigued. You will be overtrained if you do this all the time. If you train with high volume, high intensity, high frequency all the time, 52 weeks in a year, you'll be run down. It is not sustainable to train that much, that hard, and that long. It just isn't. And so the thing is that it's not that you can only choose high or low. Right? It's a spectrum. Like you can have medium. You can have high intensity, high volume, medium frequency. You can have medium volume, high intensity, high frequency. High volume, medium intensity, high frequency. Right? It's not black and white. But you still need to balance it out. And this final concept, tonnage, helps with balancing all three out. So tonnage is essentially the amount of weight you use times the amount of reps, times the amount of sets, times the amount of sessions per week per muscle group. And that equals the total amount of weight you have moved for a given muscle group. So that number, that tonnage, is the thing you want to balance out. Right? No matter how you combobulate the triad, how much you manipulate volume, intensity, frequency, with the same program, you want to have the almost similar tonnage, if not increasing in tonnage, because in reality you're going to be increasing in strength, and therefore your tonnage is always going to be growing. But you always want to have similar tonnages. If you were to decrease volume, increase intensity, right? You still want the tonnage you get at the end of that shift to be before the change. Tonnage is essentially like the amount of XP you get for training. The amount of pounds you put in sort of corresponds to the results you get. The more tonnage you move, the more results you can get, or somewhat expect to get. And with tonnage, just like volume, it's the hard sets. You only count the hard sets. Right? Tonnage is combining volume, intensity, and frequency into one number. The weight is your intensity, the sets and reps is your volume, so hard sets, and the number of sessions you do per week for muscle growth, that is your frequency. Right? It's combining volume, intensity, and frequency into one number to give you a holistic idea of how much you are doing in the gym. And that number is the pinnacle of the Trinity, of the triad. That's the number that you want to remember. That's the number that you want to take care of and be aware of. And so I hope you've learned something from this, and I hope that you can apply this to your own training, to your own program, and eventually to build your own program.